All right. So we just went over how cognition is shaped in a hermeneutic structure, right? Um, as far as individual situations. Um, how does this apply specifically to moralizing? Well, this is where prejudice comes in. Right? Our values exist prior to the situations in which we find ourselves imposing them onto, or more to the point, or put another way, called forth to be demanded of us in form of judging the particular situation. Uh, those same values exist prior to us encountering those situations that we do moralize. Um, thus, they stand in the background functionally, shaping how it is that we understand the situations we find ourselves in. In this way, they are, in the broadest understanding of the term, prejudices. So, a prejudice, in its broadest understanding, is not the sense in which we commonly encounter it today. Today, when you hear the word prejudice, you have a very, very negative understanding of it. And this is no one's fault, it's just the common usage of the word. But to understand what prejudice is, in its broadest understanding, we have to do a little bit of etymology and history. Basically, we have to look at the historically affected consciousness we have by looking at how the term, the idea of prejudice, has evolved over time. Right? In its broadest understanding, prejudice, simply put, is a generalization or conclusion made without all the evidence presented at hand. Right? So it's a judgment made before all the facts are in. Pre-judice, pre-judgment. Right? And this is very similar, if you'll recall, to Hume's own notion of ideas. Right? Generalizations made from constant similar impressions or experiences that form a rule of action in the mind. Hume and Gadamer get along great in this regard. Gadamer, just instead of using the term ideas, he's talking about the prejudices in particular, because that's expressly going to be a moral understanding of Hume's more general term of ideas. Right? So, as Gadamer put it, prejudice means a judgment that is rendered before all the elements that determine a situation have been finally examined. Right? And it certainly does not necessarily mean a false judgment on that, but part of the idea is that it can have either a positive or a negative value. So you can have prejudices that do a positive function, that boost, according to Gadamer, and prejudices that tear down as well. The clearest example of prejudice is the sense that Gadamer is referring to it, in the sense that Gadamer is referring to it, is perhaps ironically, and even more so informatively, the prejudice against prejudice. Right? So, the root word for prejudice is the Latin prejudicium, right? Which literally meant a precedent, right? Uh, sort of like a legal precedent, right? When you have a legal precedent, you're making a decision based off of prior legal decisions other judges have made, right? It's like, well, it's been this way before. I'm using this to inform my own decision in the here and now. That's what a prejudice was, or what prejudicium meant. Right? It's a judgment based on previous decisions. Right? So time marched on, history crept forward with it, and language evolved, and we get the French, early French, Old French, préjudice, right? From which we get the English loanword prejudice. Right? The word the word prejudicium maintained its original understanding up until some time within the early hundreds ADs, right? Probably closer to 1000 AD, honestly. When Christian scholars made advances in logic, right? And they wanted to separate out good logical precedents, logical reasoning, from precedent-based reasoning, legal reasoning, right? And thus, in trying to more clearly define the strictures of logic, we separated it out prejudice as a judgment, sort of a hasty judgment, a judgment made before all the elements were in. So a judgment that's not based on logic alone. It's not necessarily an incorrect judgment. Again, not necessarily incorrect, but it is, however, a judgment that is not strictly logical. You can't see each step the way you can in a logically broken down argument, right? So you can have a prejudice in this evolved understanding, in this understanding that evolved out of prejudicium. You can have a prejudice, and it can be correct, right? It can be a correct judgment, but it's not a purely logical one. And that's where we get the beginnings of the divide that led to our modern understanding, right? 1, 2, skip a few hundred years, and you get to the early modern period, which emphasizes the division between reason, or logical reasoning, and experience, with the advent of mathematics or more advanced forms of mathematics and science, right, and the empirical method in particular. What you get over time from this is that experience and reason become even more divided. So this is one of the things that affected and formed the more modern understanding, until you get to people like philosophers like Kant and Hume, where reason in one shape or another gives us a guiding principle that's untainted by any sort of preconceived notion, right? What happened was, with modern philosophy, we got the deification of reason. It wasn't reason that made man God-like. Reason itself became godly. That was one of the things. That was one of the things that came out of early modern philosophy and the advent of the empirical method. We no longer had to appeal to explanations of God in order to explain things, or they became less firm or less necessary. And over time, it became more and more science-based, right? And more based in what reason can inform us. But this sort of reason had to be completely separated out from any impurities, any prejudgments, anything that isn't what the world, the information itself, tells us. Thus, prejudice, with the deification, the positive valuation of reason in this way, prejudice became negatively valued. It became demonized, as it were, until we get to this idea that to have any sort of prejudice is for it to be necessarily negative. And this is problematic because our reasoning is by nature prejudiced. Not in that contemporary sense where it's necessarily negative, but in that we make these hasty generalizations all the time, right? That's not to say we can't go back and revise our judgments, but we don't get by in life without making these sort of assumptions, right? And these assumptions are informed by those values that we hold, by our own experiences, and they wind up shaping how we understand things. Right?